Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you again to the West Main Church of Christ, and I want to invite you to turn in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 37. Go ahead and turn in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 37. Our sermon today is going to be a character study. We're going to be talking about one specific individual from the book of Genesis, and we're going to be looking at his life and looking at how we can live like him. But before we get into his life, before we get to Genesis 37, I want to share a proverb with you. Proverbs chapter 25 and verse 28. Again, that's Proverbs 25 and verse 28 says, "A man without self-control is like a city broken into and left without walls." I want to read that one more time. "A man without self-control is like a city broken into and left without walls." If you think about people that have no self-control, maybe a specific person in your life comes to mind, maybe you come to mind, but when you think about someone who doesn't have any self-control, they have no guardrails. All bets are off. There are no rules. They just do whatever they want. They have no self-control. And sometimes when we talk about self-control, we can talk about any number of specific things. We can talk about spending money. We can talk about how we eat. We can talk about controlling our anger. We can talk about controlling the lust of the flesh. We're going to talk about that a little bit this morning. But today we're going to be talking about Joseph. How can we live like Joseph? What do we learn from Joseph's life? And I want us to be thinking about this proverb that I just read. Think about a man without self-control and how bad that could get if Joseph had no self-control. Because I think as we go through the story of Joseph and some of the things he goes through, what we're going to see is one that Joseph is kind of a passive actor in his own life. And what I mean by that is a lot of things happen to Joseph. And obviously Joseph is in control of how he responds to those things. He has his way of responding to those things. But he maintains so much self-control through all these different seasons of his life. Of all the characters in the Bible, there are very few that have higher highs and lower lows than Joseph. He goes through some of the most incredible experiences and through some of the most terrifying experiences I think a human could go through at all. And yet somehow he maintains this level of self-control no matter what he's going through. And for some context about Joseph's life, I want to look at Genesis chapter 37 and read verses 2 through 11 because he's going to have a couple of dreams. Many of us are familiar with Joseph, but we know that he had 11 brothers total, 1 younger, 10 older, and there was a lot of drama, let's just say, before he was born about who was the favorite wife, who was the favorite mother, who was going to be the favorite son. And Joseph very clearly becomes that favorite son. Now, for the parents who have multiple kids, if there's anything we learn from Jacob, it's that choosing favorites never works out well. And these dreams that Joseph is going to have are kind of a testament to that, and just kind of the culture that is happening with him and his brothers. Read with me in verse 2. "These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock of his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a robe of many colors, but when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his other brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, 'Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf.' His brothers said to him, 'Are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to rule over us?' So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept this saying in mind. As we think about what we just read, and we think about Joseph's personality, some people kind of get into a debate about these dreams, and, is it Joseph's fault that he had these dreams? Is he being braggadocious about these dreams? Would it be annoying to hear your little brother say he had a dream that you were bowing down to him? Of course it would be. But notice again, Joseph doesn't really do much in this story. And again, what I mean by that is he has these dreams. He doesn't really, we're not really told that he's bragging about them. He tells them to his brothers. He has these two dreams. But notice what it says about the way Jacob is treating them. Jacob has kind of created this culture of everybody knows Joseph is the favorite son. Everybody can see this special coat that he got. Everybody can see the way he's being treated. Even at the beginning, we read briefly, and there's another passage that talks about him specifically being sent to report on his brothers. So putting the second youngest in charge of the 10 older brothers is probably not a great idea either if you're wanting them to all get along. So that we see these different things where we just kind of have this culture where these dreams are going to send Joseph's life on a very specific trajectory. These dreams are not going to end, well, they are going to end well, but there's going to be lots of highs and lots of lows as we go through Joseph's life. But as we go through these different things that Joseph goes through and we look at his life, I want us to think about how he's controlling himself. And one of the first things that we see him controlling is he's controlling his lust of the flesh. As we know, if you want to turn to Genesis chapter 39, that's where we're going to be next. But in Genesis chapter 39, he has been sold into slavery after these dreams. He's been sold into slavery, and yet even in slavery, he finds himself the top servant in one of the elite houses of Egypt. So he's been sold. He's been shipped all the way to Egypt, basically, and now he finds himself in this position where he's in a very powerful position in this house. Read with me in Genesis chapter 39 and verse 1. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of the house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field, so he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" This is a common theme that we're going to see through Joseph's life. He goes through some terrible things, and yet we're told that throughout all of these things, God is with him. No matter what Joseph's going through, no matter who hates him, who's persecuting him, what people say about him, what people think about him, God is with him. And God is causing, no matter where he goes, God is causing everything he does to succeed. And you see that Joseph realizes that too. It's not just like God is out there somewhere managing Joseph's life, and Joseph has no idea what's going on. He has a clear relationship with God, and because of that clear relationship with God, he shows this integrity and this self-control in Potiphar's house. And what's interesting is we really don't get much of an indication of what Joseph thought of Potiphar's wife. I would imagine he thought she was annoying. We don't know if he thought she was beautiful, or we don't really know anything about what he felt about her other than, this is not an option. Get away from me, because God is with me. God has blessed me this far, and I cannot do this great wickedness and sin against God. And what we're going to see time and time again throughout these difficult periods that Joseph goes through is that he knows that God is with him. He knows who's in charge. And I think as we think about this idea of self-control, one thing that we're going to see is if we know and we have faith that God is in control, then that makes it a lot easier for us to control ourselves. Because Potiphar's wife's whole idea is, we're alone in the house right now. There's only two of us here. And yet the truth of the matter that Joseph points out here is, we are not alone. We might be the only two human beings in this house, but there is someone else here. There is someone else watching. There is someone else who will know exactly what is going on. And frankly, I care much more about his opinion of me than I do about yours. And so that's how he's able to control this lust, control these fleshly desires that he may have had, and maintain his self-control. And we see, again, that God continues to bless him despite what happens after this. We know from the verses between what we just read and what we're about to read that Potiphar's wife has him sent to prison. She makes some false accusations about him and has him sent to prison because he said no to her. But read what happens in verse 20. Joseph's master took him, but this is Potiphar. Potiphar finds out about these accusations. Obviously, he doesn't know that they're false. He's believing his wife. But then in verse 20, Joseph's master took him and put him into prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. We see this idea over and over again in Joseph's life, where he's thrown into a pit by his brothers, unjustly. He didn't really do anything wrong. And yet God makes that succeed. God sends him to Egypt. Yes, he's a slave. Yes, he's a servant. But he's in charge, and he's basically the top slave, again, in one of the most powerful houses in Egypt. And yet here, even after, imagine how horrific it would be, how terrifying it would be to be in the position he was in, to be a young man that's far away from home. You're trying to be godly. You're trying to do everything right. And yet to have these false allegations made against you, these are some pretty steep allegations, right? There's some pretty big things to say about someone. And yet even in prison, the second time now, if you think about it, he's been falsely imprisoned. God makes it work out for good. God is with him and God is there. So even in prison, Joseph maintains this control because all the while he knows that God is in control. But as we think more about these hard times, we think about maintaining self-control. Sometimes when we get low, the temptation can be that we're just going to become despondent. There's just no hope. All these bad things are happening to me. My world is crashing down around me. And the temptation can be there if we don't realize that God is in control, or we're thinking, all these things are happening to me. I don't really have a say in the matter. I'm just a slave. I'm just a 17-year-old boy. We can just become so desperate so fast. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, at least for me, as I read through the story of Joseph, I think I would have become very hopeless and very despondent very early in Joseph's life if I had experienced the things that he experienced. But look at how he controls that desperation, how he controls those lows as he goes through some of the things he goes through. Think about everything that he goes through. Let's go back to chapter 37 and read verse 4 with me again. I just want to highlight some things about this passage that we read just a moment ago. Verse 4, "But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him." Going back to what we were talking about a moment ago, I don't know what attitude or what perspective or what exactly Joseph said about these dreams, but I don't care how your father treats you. I don't care what dreams you have. I don't care how somebody talks. If you are physically incapable of speaking peacefully to someone, I would argue that's a you problem. No matter what has happened there, this incapacity to speak peacefully, especially to your own flesh and blood, especially to someone younger than you, that's an issue. And so again, no matter what else had happened, he experiences this great hatred on the part of his brothers. But then continue with me in verse 18. They saw him from afar. This is after he's been told, go check on your brothers, go see what they're doing and bring a report back to me. Verse 18, they saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams." That line is, I think, in my opinion, one of the most sinister lines in all of Scripture. Imagine your older siblings seeing you from a distance, and before you're even really visible to them, they know who you are, and they're saying, "Here comes this dreamer. Let's kill him. Let's throw him in a pit. Let's lie to our dad about it, and then we'll see what becomes of his dreams." It's absolutely vile. And he would have known. We're going to read some verses later that kind of seem to indicate Joseph knew what was going on. Joseph would have known that his brothers felt this way about him. And especially after being thrown in a pit and being sold into slavery, all those years of thinking about why, that he probably knew that it wasn't fair. Again, whatever he thought, whatever his perspective was, experiencing that level of hatred would just be absolutely terrible. And if we fast forward a little bit to chapter 40 and verse 15, chapter 40 and verse 15, he's talking to some of his fellow prisoners when he's in prison after Potiphar's wife has thrown him in prison. And he says, "For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit." Notice that word "also" there. He's in prison. He knows he didn't do anything wrong. He knows God knows the truth about what happened between him and Potiphar's wife, which was nothing. And he's saying, this is now the second time in my life that I've been essentially imprisoned for doing nothing. And so again, he would have known, he would have experienced these things, and it would have been so easy to say, God is against me, God has forsaken me, God's not here right now, he's forgotten about me, and to have this perspective of just complete desperation and complete hopelessness. But we get to see later how he controlled himself. This is so interesting to me when you get to read. Like I said, Joseph doesn't talk very much he says some things to Potiphar's wife. Obviously, he says that he can't do this great wickedness. He tells his brother about his dreams. But for a long time, we really don't hear his perspective on everything that has happened to him to this point. We can only imagine to an extent, but look with me at chapter 41 and verse 50. Chapter 41 and verse 50, he's talking, he's risen to power, he's second in command in Egypt. And in chapter 41 and verse 50, he's talking about this famine's about to happen, and it says, "Before the year of the famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh. For he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. And the name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Think about everything he had been through to this point, how he was hated by his brothers, how he was slandered by Potiphar's wife. And just, again, it would be so easy if either one of those things had happened. If any one little bad thing that happened to Joseph happened to me, it would be so easy to become so hopeless. And yet, look at his perspective. When he's naming his children, I don't think there have ever been more appropriate baby names for someone who had been through the things that Joseph had been through. God has made me forget all my hardship. And then Ephraim, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Everything that he had been through to this point, he said, God has made me fruitful. Yes, some bad things have happened to me. Yes, some people hate me. Yes, I've been in the pit literally twice. And yet God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. These great highs and these great lows, but he's able to manage it all because he knows that God was with him the entire time and that God was in control. And the last thing I want to mention that Joseph controlled was bitterness. Again, I think on the flip side of controlling this hopelessness, when people hurt us, and when we know that people don't like us, and when people lie about us, it can be so easy to let those things build over time. Maybe there are people who did something really terrible to us 20 years ago. Maybe there's people who did things to us back in high school or back in college, and maybe we'll never see that person again, but somehow it still keeps us awake at night. I'm sure everyone in this auditorium has been mistreated. And I'm sure we have all had things said to us or done to us that we very well may never forget. We likely won't forget. And yet, how do you think about those things? How do you think about those people? Because if there was ever a person who, from a worldly perspective, I want to make that clear, from a worldly perspective, would have been completely justified and in the position to completely take revenge on the people who hated him, his brothers. There was never someone who would have, in theory, been more justified and in a better position to completely wipe out his enemies and take vengeance on all the people who had done him wrong in one fell swoop, and yet he doesn't. Look with me at Genesis chapter 42. He has this chance at revenge, and we're going to see what he does. Genesis chapter 42 and verse 7. Joseph saw his brothers. This famine has started. They're coming to get food from Egypt because Joseph has helped Egypt get through the famine. And then he sees them again. Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke roughly to them. "Where do you come from?" he said. And they said, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." And Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. And Joseph remembered the dreams that he had dreamed of them, and he said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land." They said to him, "No, my lord, your servants have come to buy food. We are all sons of one man. We are honest men. Your servants have never been spies." And so he gets into this, essentially an argument with his brothers where he sees his brothers again, and he's clearly messing with them, right? He's clearly taking advantage of the fact that they may think he's dead by now. They have no idea what happened after he sold them to that group. They have no idea what would have happened to him, and so they're certainly not expecting him to be this man who's in charge, right-hand man to the Pharaoh. And so he sees this, and again, is he messing with them? Is this just a completely, passive way of dealing with this? No. But he gets some answers after all these years of why. Again, we're not told what he knew, what he would have thought, but read with me in verse 21, skipping down to verse 21. We're told some things about what happened that day. They're starting to feel guilty because of all this trouble that Joseph is causing for them. And verse 21, "Then they said to one another, 'In truth, we are guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us, and we did not listen. That is why this distress has come upon us.' And Reuben answered them, 'Did I not tell you to sin against the boy? But you did not listen, so now here comes a reckoning for his blood.' And they did not know that Joseph understood them, for there was an interpreter between them." So Joseph isn't even speaking to them in their language. He's using this interpreter. He's using kind of this guise of just being a government official that doesn't know who they are. But imagine being Joseph and everything that you've gone through because of what your brothers did to you all those years ago, and hearing them say, "We heard him crying out. We heard him begging for his life. We wanted to kill him. We decided not to." And just knowing everything they would have heard and knowing how hard their hearts would have been and how hateful and bitter they would have been towards him, and yet here in this moment he's holding back. He is not going to treat them exactly the way they treated him because he knows that that's just not worth it. He's controlling this bitterness in this time of conflict. But keep reading with me in chapter 43. Chapter 43 and verse 26. When Joseph came home, they brought into the house to him the present that they had with them, and bowed to him to the ground. And he inquired about their welfare and said, "Is your father well, the old man of whom you spoke? Is he still alive?" And they said, "Your servant, our father, is well. He is still alive." And they bowed their heads and prostrated themselves, and he lifted up his eyes and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, and said, "Is this your youngest brother of whom you spoke to me? God be gracious to you, my son." Then Joseph hurried out, for his compassion grew warm for his brother, and he sought a place to weep, and he entered his chamber and wept there. Then he washed his face and came out, and controlling himself, he said, "Serve the food." So in this position, in this context, where he could do anything he wanted to his brothers. And again, does he make it easy for them? No. But seeing Benjamin again, and really you kind of see Joseph's perspective, it kind of seems like in all this, sending them away with the money and the cups, and again, we don't really have time to get into all of that story, but this difficulty that he's giving them, it doesn't really even seem to be coming from a place of bitterness or pettiness as much as he wants to see Joseph and Jacob again. All he wanted is to see his father and to see his brother, and we see that in this compassion that he has for his brother, where he's trying to maintain this position, this guise of not knowing who they are. But he finally gets to see his brother again. But we're finally going to get to see his perspective on it all in chapter 45 and verse 1. Chapter 45, the truth finally comes out, and verse 1 tells us, "Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. He cried, 'Make everyone go out from me.' So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and he wept aloud, so that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, 'I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?' But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed by his presence." Notice how we're finally told that Joseph loses control, but it's not he loses control and kills them all or throws them all in prison or anything like that. He loses control because everything's finally coming out. The truth is finally addressed. They finally know, I'm here, I survived, and God has been with me thus far. And we see in the following verses how he's able to do it. But before we get into Joseph, more of what Joseph says here, I want us to ask ourselves the question, when we think about this self-control, and we think about all the things we need to control in our lives, do we stay under control when bitterness creeps in? I don't know that any of us have been treated as bad by someone as close to us as what Joseph went through. And to a point, it's not really fair to even compare that. I know that. But think about the people you might feel bitter towards, you might not like, and think about Joseph here and his brothers and being in a pit and being in prison and spending all those years alone, being shipped off to a foreign country when you're so young. And the question that I have, at least, when I think about, okay, how do I control my bitterness? How do I control my desperation? How do I control these things? How do I stay under control in the way that Joseph did? How do I live like Joseph? My question is, how did he do it? How did he stay in such firm control, in such strong control of his emotions and of all these different things? Chapter 45 and verse 4, he continues, Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." And they came near, and he said, "I'm your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on this earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler of all the land of Egypt." I would imagine that seeing your brothers again after everything that had happened, it would be so easy to go right back there and see them and just let loose. All the things you had been thinking, if he were a different type of person, all the hatred that would have been built up by then. And yet he says, "You didn't send me to Egypt, God did." Thanks be to God that he saw fit to put me through this trial so that I could preserve life. I'm saving lives by the things I'm doing in helping Egypt through this famine. You, my family, the family of Israel, is benefiting from this food being preserved in Egypt. God brought me here to save lives. And so he knew that God was with him. He was never alone. Him and Potiphar weren't alone in the house that day. He wasn't alone the first time he was thrown into a pit. He wasn't alone when he was thrown into prison. God was always with him, and he never forgot that. God was the one who made him successful. God was the one who put him in this position in Potiphar's house. God was the one who brought him safely to Egypt. God was always with him. And another thing is that he knew his life was bigger than him. Look at what he says here about, I'm saving lives. I'm helping the people of Egypt. I'm helping the world. I'm helping preserve this family so that through me, God will continue to fulfill his promises. My life is bigger than me. This isn't as simple as just, there are so many jokes that could be made about sibling rivalry when you're studying through the story of Joseph. And yet he says, God brought me to Egypt to preserve life. God made me successful in the land of Egypt. And so if he saw fit to do that, and he has a bigger purpose for all of this, then thank God for that. I'm not going to be the one to question it. Because as a man of God, as a faithful person, my life is bigger than me. Which brings us to his faith. Joseph has such incredible faith. And I want to read the last few verses of Genesis chapter 50. The last few verses of the book of Genesis are actually about Joseph. Verse 22 of Genesis 50, "So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children to the third generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were accounted as Joseph's own. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you will carry my bones up from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt." If we're thinking about self-control and thinking about the fact that I can control myself because I know God is in control of my life, think about that in the context of what Joseph says here. He says, I'm about to leave. I'm going somewhere. I'm not going to be with you anymore. But I have built my life on the fact that God has never gone anywhere. God is big enough and powerful enough that he can be with all of us, and he will be with all of us. He promises us that. And Joseph had faith in that fact. And you see that in the way he says, I'm leaving, but God has been with you to this point, and God will continue to be with you. I know for a fact that he will bring you out of Egypt because he has said he would. And I want to point out one thing from Hebrews chapter 11. In Hebrews chapter 11, we're told, we know Hebrews 11 as the Hall of Faith, the Hall of Fame of faith, and Joseph is mentioned here, and I'm not a Greek scholar by any means. And what I'm about to tell you is actually taken from another sermon that Brother Jason Longstreth in Tampa mentioned. He does teach Greek at Florida College, so he knows much more of what he's talking about than I do. But read with me Hebrews 11 and verse 22. By faith Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. Now, what I want to point out is that phrase that I'm reading from the ESV, that phrase that's translated there, he made mention of the Exodus, is actually in Greek the word for to remember something. Now, if you think about that for a second, Joseph remembered something that happened after he died. Now, what does that mean? He was so confident in the Exodus and the fact that it was going to happen and the fact that his family was going to be delivered that he talked about it almost as something that was in the past. When we leave Egypt, like I know we're going to, bring my bones with you. And when we're talking about all these people of faith in Hebrews chapter 11, that's what Joseph is remembered for, because that mindset was built on the precedent of his entire life from when he was 17 years old and probably before that. I know God is with me in this pit. I know God has a reason for me to be here, even though I'm at the lowest low. I know I'm not completely alone. I can have faith in the fact that God is here, God knows what he's doing, and God is in control. And so when I'm presented with an opportunity to give in to the lust of the flesh, or to give in to some of those hopeless, desperate, despondent thoughts that I'm being tempted with, or when I'm being tempted in any other way. Maybe I'm being tempted to be arrogant because I'm the most powerful person in Potiphar's house. I'm the second most powerful person in all of Egypt. Whatever way I'm being tempted, I can be in control of those things because God has always been with me. God will always be with his people, and I can and will rest assured in that fact. That's where Joseph's self-control comes from. And so if we return to our proverb that we started with, a man without self-control is like a city broken into and left without walls. Does that sound like a description of Joseph at all? Because I'll be honest with you, a lot of what Joseph went through would have left me like a city broken into and left without walls. I would not have controlled myself probably as well as he did. And yet we can look at him and the way he lives and the way he talks and the way he walks and the faith that he has and say, I know God is with his people. I know my life is bigger than me. And I know I can be faithful to God because God is faithful to me. But that's the encouragement I would leave you with. Think about Joseph, think about his faith, and as we close, I want to offer the invitation of the gospel. We've been talking about the Old Testament, but the God that Joseph served is just as faithful now. He is just as much God now as he was then. Don't be like this man that we read about in Proverbs that has no self-control, that just goes wherever he's tempted to go. Put God in control of your life. Put on Christ in baptism. Have your sins washed away. There's no better way, there's no other way to give your life to God. Put him in control and be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins. If we can help you do that, please come forward while we stand and while we sing.